Good evening, and welcome again to the Dusty Feet. It's the 28th of July already. Holy smokes, it's already the end of July. Month 7, down the tubes, right? Not down the tubes, we're done and over. So, tonight, we're going to jump into some stuff with Leviticus. I know, everyone's favorite book. It's on the top of your bestsellers list. It's the thing you want to talk about. Or maybe not. However, I think maybe after you talk tonight, you might think again. So it could be fun, right? Don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, learning we do here does not happen. And please be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so let's start with a quick 5-minute video that wraps up Exodus and segues into Leviticus. Yes, we've seen this before, but it seems appropriate. And then John makes a point or statement in it that I want to chat about tonight as well, okay? So enjoy the video. It is part of the Torah series videos on their app too, also. So enjoy the video. It's on Exodus 19 through 40.
The first half of the book of Exodus tells the story of ancient Israel being rescued from slavery. And when people say the Exodus story, those are the chapters they're referring to.
But the book has a second half where Moses gives the 10 Commandments to Israel along with these instructions about building a sacred tent.
And what links these two halves together is this crucial story. The people of Israel, they're out in the middle of nowhere. They find themselves at the foot of this mountain called Sinai. And here, God's presence comes dramatically down in the form of a violent storm cloud.
Now let's stop a second and talk about this concept of God's presence, because it's really important for the rest of the book. At the beginning of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, humanity was in God's presence. They had this close relationship with Him, and it was good. But humanity rebels, and the relationship is fractured, and access to God's presence is lost. But God promised Abraham that He would restore His blessing to all of the nations, and that includes this restoration of relationship and access to God's presence.
So here at Sinai, God's presence is now right here in front of them, and it's actually quite frightening. And He's here to invite Israel into this unique and close relationship with Him.
And the word used to describe this relationship is covenant. It's like a legal agreement between God and Israel. And it's unique because up till now, God hasn't asked Israel to do anything in return, just to trust Him. But here on this mountain, God is going to ask Israel to do something. A lot of things, actually. He gives them a whole set of laws. It includes the 10 Commandments. And if they obey these commandments, they will become the people who will represent God to the nations of the world.
Like a priest would.
Yeah, in fact, that's what God calls them to become, a kingdom of priests. And this is all connected back to the promise to Abraham that his family would become a blessing to the nations.
Okay, but obeying these laws is going to be difficult because there's a lot of them, and they set a really high standard.
Though if you think about it, of anybody in the world who should be able to do it, it's these people. who experienced firsthand God's grace and his power when he rescued them from slavery.
And they agree to obey the terms, but then they refuse to go into God's presence because it's still a bit frightening.
And since the people won't go up, Moses goes up to the mountain by himself to meet with God. But God still wants to be with all of his people. And so he says, okay, if the people won't come up here to me, I'll come down off this mountain to be with you all. And that's why he orders Moses to build this elaborate tent as a place where God's presence can be among his people.
And that's why the next thing we get is 7 chapters of extremely detailed architectural blueprints for this tent. It's really, really long.
But every detail is important and has some kind of symbolic value. For example, there's all this Garden of Eden imagery inside the tent. And it's to remind you that when you're in the tent, you are in God's presence.
Then we get another 6 chapters describing how they built the tent, which is really just repeating the same blueprints word for word.
Now let's back up, because before the tent is finished, there's this super important story. Moses is coming off the mountain with the 10 commandments and the blueprints in his hands, and he finds Israel breaking the first 2 commands of the covenant.
Don't have any other gods before me, and don't worship idol statues.
Right, and so here we are. Immediately after agreeing to the covenant, they're throwing this ritual party, they're worshiping an idol. And so God says to Moses, you know what, this is not going to work. I should just wipe these people out and start over with you.
But Moses reminds God of his promise to Abraham and pleads with God to spare them, which is a really weird conversation. Why would God need to be reminded of something?
Yeah, it does seem odd, but this dialogue is inviting us into God's experience of grief and pain due to Israel's actions. And he really could walk away. But instead, this God chooses faithfulness to his own promises, even though he knows it's going to cost him.
So we come to the end of the book. The tabernacle's built, God's presence comes down off the mountain to fill it, and in the final scene, Moses goes to enter the tabernacle to be in God's presence.
But he can't. He's actually not able to go inside, and that's how the book ends.
Why can't he go in? That was the whole point.
So when Israel worshiped the golden calf, it was like a slap in the face to God's faithfulness. And so Moses can't just waltz into the tent like everything's just fine. There's a deeper problem still in this relationship.
Will they ever be able to fix the relationship and go into God's presence?
Well, that's what the next book, Leviticus, is all about.
Hey, this is John.
And this is Tim.
We believe the Bible is one long story, and so we like to look at each individual book and see how it's designed to fit in that story.
We also take core themes of the Bible and see how they develop from the beginning of its story all the way through to the end.
We're a nonprofit, and we'd love your help to make more videos. Go to jointhebibleproject.com and see what video we're raising money for right now.
We just hit 25,000 subscribers on YouTube. Totally awesome. You could be the next one.
You could download full resolution versions of this video and all of our videos. You could find study guides. It's all for free at jointhebibleproject.com.
Okay. So what is our Leviticus paradigm? Okay. What have we been taught about this scroll, right? As we're going there, right? Do we have any bias? Are we influenced by someone or something, right? Have we been so ingrained by previous teachings that we can't really see through to what is written? At times, maybe not seeing the trees for the forest. I know that's upside down from the original quote, but are we missing what's right there? Okay. Challenging paradigms like, what is God's presence, right? How do we view that? What are your thoughts? What do you think? Is God everywhere all the time? If so, then why is his presence important in space, right? What does that presence represent? What does it affect? What's its purpose? There might be a bias or a paradigm that God cannot be in proximity to sin. So if this is the case, and I'll bite here for discussion's sake, what's the proximity clause with that then? As in, how far away, right? Moses was a man. I use the term that coins us all, sinner, right? Yet he spent time with God regularly in the tent of meeting, up on the mountain. In fact, he was allowed to see the back of God walking away, right? Prior to those meetings, in context, of course, for Moses, right? There was little or no preceding ritual that he let him allow to be in close proximity to God. So maybe we have some more paradigms to muddle through. Now, what about if someone told you that X was bad or too difficult to do? Would you be able to really challenge that when you were reading that X was good and not too difficult? I guess a very introspective question, maybe. It can be uncomfortable. Maybe I just don't want to do it. Or even, I don't know how that's going to apply to me today when you're asking yourself these things. I personally am trying to be willing to come in open-palmed with my current understanding and be willing to review my beliefs. Can we both agree? That said, we can jump into Leviticus, okay? Probably a book or scroll, like I said, was top of your list, right? Truthfully, it's probably a scroll that many have avoided or ignored due to maybe a previous experience or maybe a teaching. And if you try to read it in the KJV, the King James, the old King James, it's really awkward to read. I tried it, and it's really awkward, okay? I say that because if you're reading a book, right, would you ignore part of that book and then honestly expect to understand and grasp the whole story of that book? If someone said that part's boring or it's just not important, would you just skip it? I guess maybe another introspective question is, how important is this book, the book you're reading, whichever one we're talking about, Bible in particular here, how important is this book, this collection of books, these scrolls, these letters? I mean, really, how important is the entire book? Of course, this is a loaded question, and it comes with its own preloaded bias a lot, okay? I really do like the point that the Bible Project makes, that the entire collection of these scrolls and letters lead us to and point to Jesus, to Yeshua, right? So with that in mind, as a simple place to start, again, I should ask, should we ignore or avoid any of these scrolls or letters? And at what peril or risk do we put ourselves if we choose to do such, right? So at least from my experience in my religious church past, personally, right, I was told that Jesus came to take these all away, that they were fulfilled. That's a whole nother discussion, okay? But it never really sat well with me. And it took 40 years to really decide to finally open up my palms. I found it such a challenge to try and embrace one train of thought. And then when I find something that conflicts it, and then what do I do about it? Before I used to fight or ignore or rationalize or exclude. Or now, maybe, I can embrace the discomfort and then maybe see where else it takes us, right? Okay, so to front load this discussion, we might want to come up with a few points to address as we wander this path, okay? Okay, so let's watch this video that kind of sets up the Leviticus scroll and paradigm questions that we're going to talk about, okay? So let's listen to the video scroll with them on Leviticus. And I think you'll enjoy this. I know I did.
The book of Leviticus, we know you've been avoiding it because it's weird. So let's fix that. Now remember, the story of the Bible began with humans in God's presence, but they were banished because of their rebellion. However, God wants to be in relationship with us, so he chooses one family that he will use to restore the world back into his presence.
And so God's presence comes to dwell in a tent right in the middle of Israel.
And that's great.
But it creates a problem because it's so intense that Moses can't go in, and other priests who enter inappropriately, they die.
Well, wait, if God's presence is good, how is it all of a sudden dangerous for people?
So think of it this way. God's presence is like the sun. It's pure power and goodness. And when something mortal and corruptible gets close to such pure power, it's destroyed. And so the word holiness is used in Leviticus to describe God's pure and powerful presence, which, like the sun, is both good and dangerous. So the point of Leviticus is to show how corrupt Israelites can live near God's goodness without being destroyed. Now, in the book, there are 3 ways for how this is all going to work out, and these are going to seem strange to you, but just hang in there with us.
The first one is rituals. The second is this idea of the priesthood, and the third is a bunch of purity laws.
Now, the book is broken up into 7 sections, and each solution is explored in 2 sections of the book. The rituals are here, the priests are here, and the purity laws go here.
Now, the first solution, rituals, involves a lot of animal sacrifices. And so Leviticus begins with detailed instructions for how to make these sacrifices. Some are ways of saying thank you to God, and others are simply ways of saying, I'm sorry.
And here at the end of the book, there are some more rituals. These are about observing sacred days and festivals. They're all celebrations that retell some part of the story of how God rescued Israel and set them apart from the nations.
The second solution to the holiness problem has to do with priests. You see, being directly in God's presence is really dangerous. So he appoints priests as special representatives who can go into his presence on behalf of others.
So in this section, we have a story about how the priests are ordained into the priesthood. And then this other section explains the set of higher standards that the priests have to live by because they work so closely to God's presence.
The third solution in the book is all about purity laws. And this is by far the hardest thing to understand. For example, in this section, we're really concerned with knowing whether you're clean or unclean.
Or another way of saying that is being pure and impure. And here's what we need to know to understand this. When you're in a pure state, you can be near God's presence. When you're in an impure state, you can't. And so it was really important for Israelites to know what state they're in at any given moment.
So the first thing we have is a list of pure and impure animals.
Yeah, this list of animals is divided up by where they live. So on the land, in the sea, in the air. And the text is just not clear about why certain animals are impure or why touching or eating them makes you impure. What is clear, however, is that avoiding these creatures will set Israel apart, and it will remind them that God's own holiness should affect every part of their lives, including what they eat.
After the food laws, we get a lot of random rules about things like skin disease, touching dead bodies, what to do with bodily fluids.
But they're not random. All of these are things that the Israelites associated with life and death, which are sacred things because God is the author of life.
Okay, but simply coming into contact with these things makes you impure?
They do, but we have to keep in mind that it's not wrong or sinful to be ritually impure. You just wait a few days, take a bath, offer sacrifice, and you're pure again. What is inappropriate is entering into God's presence when you're in an impure state.
Now, there's more purity laws over here in this section.
Yeah, these focus on Israel's moral behavior. So these are laws about social justice, healthy relationships, having sexual integrity. Living by these laws will make Israel into a morally pure people who can live near God's presence.
Those are the three solutions. Now, you've probably noticed that they surround the very center of this book, and it's here that we find a really important ritual called the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, so Israel's a big tribe now, and odds are there's a lot of sin happening that goes unnoticed, that people are not dealing with. And so one time a year, the priests would take 2 goats, and one of those goats is killed, and its blood is carried right into God's presence where it symbolically covers or atones for Israel's sin.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, the meaning of the sacrifice, it's explained in the next chapter, where God says that the blood of a creature is its life. And so this goat's life is offered as a substitute. It's receiving God's punishment for Israel's sin so that the people don't have to.
That leaves the second goat.
Yeah, the priest puts his hands on it, and then he confesses all the sins of Israel. It's like he's placing the sins on the goat. And then that goat gets cast out forever into the wilderness. It's called the scapegoat.
Yeah, I've heard that word before.
Yeah, it's this very powerful image of how God is graciously removing Israel's sin.
But let's be honest, sacrifices in general seem so barbaric.
We have to remember that in the ancient world, sacrifices were the main way of buying favor from the gods. But the problem was that those same gods, they're unpredictable, they're fickle, you never know if they're going to ignore you or they're going to turn on you. And so it's in this cultural setting that we see Israel's God as totally different. He does get angry about human corruption, but it is never arbitrary. And he loves people. So he provides this clear way for Israel to know with confidence that they are forgiven and that despite their corruption, they are safe to live near his presence. And so that makes the book of Leviticus actually a revolutionary statement in its day.
So that's Leviticus. But Israel's still at Mount Sinai in the middle of the wilderness. They need a place to live.
Yes, the land God promised to Abraham. And so the journey to that land is what the next book of the Bible is all about.
Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We believe the Bible is telling one overall story from beginning to end. And so we're making videos about each individual book of the Bible, its unique design and message, and then how it fits into that overall storyline.
We also make theme videos where we take one biblical theme and we trace it from the beginning of Scripture all the way to the end.
We're a nonprofit, and we want to give all these videos away for free. So you can join us in making them by going to jointhebibleproject.com. You could give a one-time gift, a monthly gift, a few dollars, a lot of dollars. Anything will help, and we'd love you to join us in making these.
If you go to our website, you can download a full resolution version of this video, play it in your church or school or whatever. We also have study guides to help you get through the content with other people. It's all for free at jointhebibleproject.com.
Okay. So a bit to unpack, and I'm going to probably rabbi trail a few things, but we'll see what we go. Okay, so John mentions in the first video, okay, that these instructions, we're talking about Leviticus in particular, right, would be too difficult, right, was the word. So a question popped up in my head. This popped up in my head. I said, does God set us up? Did God set them up? Did he give them something that they were not really capable of doing? That really, in truth, that they really were not capable of doing? That this is truly impossible. So a test that God knew they would fail. In other words, I set you up for failure. Not that the option is going to go as that. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is cheat. I'm going elsewhere to address this question I brought up. It's outside of Exodus and Leviticus, for that matter. It's in Deuteronomy. Okay? About that question, and then what we're going to get into this. So it's Deuteronomy, and it's chapter 30. I'll read it to you. So it will be when all of these things have come upon you, the blessings and the curse which I have placed before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul in accordance with everything that I am commanding you today, you and your sons, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity. He's going to have compassion on you and will gather you again from the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If any of your scattered countrymen are at the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there will bring you back. That's that lost sheep thought. Just thought about that. The Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will be good to you and make you more numerous than your fathers. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, so that you may live. And the Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, those who persecuted you. And you will again obey the Lord and follow all his commandments, which I am commanding you today. Then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly in every work of your hand, in the children of your womb, in the offspring of your cattle, in the produce of your ground. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. For this commandment, which I'm commanding you today, is not too difficult for you, nor is it far away. It's not in heaven that you could say, who will go up to heaven for us? Get it for us, and then proclaim it to us, so that we may follow it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you could say, who will cross the sea for us and get it for us and proclaim it to us, so that we may follow it? On the contrary, the word is very near to you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart, that you may follow it. See, I have placed before you today life and happiness, death and adversity. In that, I'm commanding you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his judgments, so that you may live and become numerous, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but allow yourself to be led astray and to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will certainly perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and take possession of it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have placed before you life and death, blessing and curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding close to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, so that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. So I might take exception with the paradigm thought that we were talking about before, based on that context. Okay? So just since it can hang out there for discussion as well, we can get very specific and say that this is very directive to the Jews, that the children of Israel, although it's to them, although the folks can suffer the consequences of their choices on how they treat these people, right? That they are subject to the blessings and the curses, right? Those are treat. But even with that, okay, if you stay focused on the instructions for them, as in they're not for you, okay, as God is laying out these things, that they are very important. This is life versus death issues to them and their descendants. And these instructions are for the time after the scattering, the conquering activity, the subsequent regathering. And I hope we can agree that that's still happening today. And of course, there's more to follow. Okay, so since these instructions and commandments are, God puts it in the choose life category, to have, for us to have any kind of church position that these have been done away with, that Jesus, Yeshua's death, eliminated these, would put that paradigm in direct conflict with God's own promises at a future, and I'll argue now our time in this post-scattering, gathering time frame, right? So to say that they're done away with, and no surprise why Jews will never see Jesus. Not the way he's explained. Why should they? The church has told them for centuries that these very promises, they no longer apply? And we wonder why there's such a chasm between Jews and Christians? Believe what you choose about whether you're an adopted member of the children of Israel or a believer that is amongst the nations, but to engage with the paradigm that these God-given instructions that bring blessing and life are no longer valid, that the promises attached to them no longer apply because God's Son's death and resurrection invalidated his Father's promises? That, my friend, is a very slippery slope, and one in the right or wrong context could be construed as cursing these people. That scares me a bit. Okay. Off my soapbox for now. Let's get back to the video and the topic. All right. So they break down some of these 3 parts, sections, topics in this scroll, right? We have rituals, priests, and purity, right? Rituals. Does that word scare you? What pictures does it conjure up in your head? Might we have such a problem with a word that we miss what it really has to say, that maybe, if it's helpful, there's other ways to express it? Custom, habit, practice, observance, ceremonial acts. Rituals we have today that are very common, right? Shaking hands, right? The shaking hands goes way back in ensuring the person you were in close proximity to was not armed. You grabbed their arm and you shook it, and you grabbed their arm, or was it just hands? You grabbed their arm, you shook it to make sure there was no weapons hidden up in sleeves and those kind of things. This is where these things come from. Marriage. So many cultures around the world do it so many different ways. Burial. How we bury. 6 feet under. The words we say. Something simple. Getting dressed. How someone gets dressed, the order of dressing. Most likely taught by the parents. But some places in other parts of the world, they don't wear pants and shirts and socks, and those kind of things. It's very different. Again, holidays. We have way too many of those, I think. Wearing or not wearing shoes in the house. Communion. How we do the Lord's Supper in church. You get the picture, right? Okay. So now we can say that we have them too. In other words, we have rituals. So maybe that picture might be a little less scary, maybe. And like we enjoy doing here on the Dusty Feet, we can look at them now in the context of the day that they are actually in, and then maybe how that might translate much later into our time. Okay? And that's the way we can view some of those. Priests. Are these relevant today? What I mean by that is, because are there later places in Scripture that points to us that this role, whatever shape it takes and looks like, will still be a topic to be discussed. Because if it's not, then relevancy is an issue, right? Especially because we think about, this is an odd stuff, we think about, okay, since there's no temple or tabernacle for that matter, right? Then the sacrifices, although extremely important in context in their time, has limited practical in physically practiced, right, today. And yet there's many implied and embraced practices and purposes today. Did Yeshua ever mention anything, right? Remember, it all points to him. Are there any references in letters to certain communities and individuals in the Scripture about and priests, right? You're getting that picture, right? John makes a casual statement that priests are to go into God's presence on the behalf of others. Okay, he says priests, right? So is that actually accurate? Or is it, this is my term, I've coined this new one, it's called a sloppy paradigm. Is that a sloppy paradigm? In these instructions, only one priest actually goes into the Holy of Holies, the presence location of God, and that is once a year. The rest of the thousands of priests had duties to include carrying the tabernacle, taking the individual tabernacle up and down, carrying its parts around, helping with the daily sacrifices of the people, serving God, serving others. So your average priest was not a presence of God guy for individuals. Okay? So I think we have maybe quite a few sloppy paradigms with that, yeah? Yes, they are held to a higher standard. Their life practices, what they do, and there's kind of two reasons for that, maybe that I can see. One is to be an example. Reminder that this is a smaller model of a much larger design, right? And then proximity to his presence. Okay. And then, is all proximity only actual location? Or can that even extend to one's expected role, what they're supposed to be, the gifting they have from God? To bring it forward, as in maybe as the roles that are mentioned in the letters in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, right? That they're the leadership roles that have a higher standard. They're not more important. They're not more valuable. They're just to be that representative to the people. And your proximity, and again, is it physical or is it association? And the accountability factor. Something to think about. Purity. So what about purity, right? Is it even important? Clean, unclean, pure, impure. Okay, wow. That will open up a whole Pandora's box. Animals that are deemed not food, since for these people, God said so, right? So it's an observable practice, something that a light would reflect on, that this reflects. It reflects the priests that serve me, this is God, and are to serve the nations. The purpose is not just a science thing. It's a marker, a sign. Tim makes a point that it reminds Israel of who they are. I like that. I like that. I'd like to take it one step further, if I might, and be so bold and say that it's a sign to others of who they are. That's how I'm going to recognize you. You know, it's an interesting point can be made, and I have no problem with it really, of identifying these chosen people, these children of Israel. When we see them today, I don't have any doubt at all that they serve God and how they are a light to the nations. There's writings and stories and rabbinical talk with these, and they say that in this time when we're reading these, that they're chasing unknown gods, blah blah blah. After the dispersia, that stops. Out in the dispersia, when they're in the diaspora and they're dispersed, they're out, and they start to group into communities as they've scattered and do this. Those foreign gods disappear. Are there individuals who do that? Yes. Okay. But as a community, as a whole, as a nation, those other gods, this is not a problem for them coming back. That's not the issue. When they come back after the first invasion and they come back and Nehemiah is there and they're talking, it's about that they had lost touch with this God and understanding his Torah. And when they read it again, they cried because they missed it. Okay? It wasn't about other gods. It was about back and connecting to these gods. And this is the only nation in history that its story would be that it would end when they get taken into captivity, countries are dispersed, and those nations disappear. They don't exist anymore. They don't get to come back. Israel's the only one. The only one in history. Part of that being clean, unclean, pure, impure. It's a bit interesting because part of this, right, in that causes separation, but not sin, right? In other words, to be in an unclean state, it's not a sin. How you got there might be on its own part a sin, right? But just the state, unclean and clean again, is not a sin. Okay? Touching a dead body, body fluids, not sins. But it does preclude one from the proximity of the tabernacle and possibly the community. To have a skin condition, not a sin. But it cannot be safe for others, so proximity would be limited as well in community and the tabernacle. The instructions that exclude time with another until certain things have been accomplished or time has passed, right? So to bring it to our time and a place for context analogy, I'll explain that one. So this works for doctors. I certainly want a doctor or a surgeon to clean up, dress up, and protect themselves and me before we meet in this vulnerable state, right? So this is a way to start to begin to relearn, maybe then, how we might begin our approach to this God that this is they, really don't know, right? This is their thinking when we're thinking like they are. This might begin our approach to this God differently, right? They've heard of God. They've heard of Yahweh, right? They've heard of him. They saw and experienced the mighty hand of God, right? But they really don't know him yet. That's going to take time with much trial and error. Please, let's be honest with ourselves and at least agree that we're the same. I continue to say, we are them, they are us. It still does bother me a bit, to be open and honest, that it keeps getting pointed out that they failed. Okay? And that scares me a bit too. Because does that help feed that curse mentality towards these chosen people? How do we actually learn today? We actually do use the term trial and error, right? We do. We try, and if it succeeds, then we put it in one column to be possibly repeated later, right? If we fail and don't achieve the desired result, we'll put it in a different column and hope not to repeat that later, right? However, we all too often, we even fail at that one, right? Let's be honest with ourselves again, please. So do we believe? Do we have a paradigm that along the line of instructions, guidance, wisdom for God, on these 3 points in particular, ritual, right? How we can approach God and others with safety and respect. Priests, the folks that were a representation of a much larger practice, from serving God and serving the people to serving God, the people, and the nations. And purity. What God deems clean and unclean, and that state of being in community and before God, actually, right, in the proximity, Are these now no longer applicable? That again is a paradigm that causes me concern. Again, it borders on curse. Also, again, if one chooses to say that those are for them and not us, okay. But to say that they no longer exist will be an ongoing chasm between the body of Messiah, these body parts that desperately need to work together, to serve together, to start to become the priests that serve the nations. So the sections where they talk about sexual behavior, moral justice, moral purity. I hate to sound repetitive, and I know it's probably borderline annoying by now, right? But why would the sacrifice and redemption of Jesus, Yeshua, right, cause all of these to be void, not relevant, unnecessary? Okay, for the sake of this discussion this evening, we'll agree that rituals, priests, and purity at least are relevant topics to discuss. So now we can take a step back or a step in, pick your posture, right? And now when you're reading Leviticus, now you can look at the relevance of what's being said, the importance of what's being said, and the practice in the context and time of the story of the children of Israel. Then, once you embrace that, then you can start to carry this over, to bring this over, to grasp this whole piece. Because both sides of this, as you saw in the graphic, both sides are so important. And, as he's shown, we're continuing pattern recognition, right? And we have a middle that also eventually needs to be examined as well. Okay? That Day of Atonement. This is a topic that's going to be an entire episode of itself, probably more, right? But it is the Jesus, the Yeshua element, right? The echo, the shadow of his life events, the precursors, the pointers, the things that show us there, so that when he starts looking back and these connections are made, click, 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 and we should start seeing those things, right? How God's atonement practices and the pattern it sets up is so very different from other gods, right? So very different. God is merciful. He's just. Yet in a relational way and not an appeasement way. Okay? He doesn't appease. We don't follow God to appease. Our God, this God, that God in that context is different. We don't follow God just so he doesn't punish us. That is one of the big points. Makes him different than what the other gods did. So another point that scares me again, in this paradigm practice mentality that is part of our Christian history, is to have one declare to God so that they get out of going to hell, right? This get out of jail free ticket. That to me sounds an awful lot like the other gods' appeasement to me. I'll say this, I'll make this declaration to you so that I don't suffer the consequence or the punishment. That's appeasing. That's my perspective. That's Bob's perspective. So maybe we can agree that Jesus, Yeshua, right, came. He did the part that only he could do. It's the part that none of us can or could do. Yet, as it was before, it seems to continue today that we still have a part to do. Priests, they still have a part to do. There's always been something for us to do. Is it just to live and die and then heaven's the real end, the whole point of it all, right? And the quicker we get there, maybe the better. That our lives, we're really merely just biding our time until we die and then heaven awaits. That's our purpose, our focus in life, death. But does our life matter? Of course, these are rhetorical questions, really. At least here on the Dusty Feet, because I believe that our lives very much matter. That what we do, the choices we make, are important. That can have eternal meaning. We only need to go back to the beginning of the Torah, to the beginning of our Bibles. We start asking these questions. And then we're going to come up, and we're going to end up with words like, we are to bless, to take care of, dominion, rule, co-regents, priests. All of those are earthly life issues, contexts, concerns. All of them. When Jesus completed what only he could do, and the Father raised him from that redemption death that he experienced on our behalf, then he was rewarded with the rule of the kingdom. And this includes our earthly kingdom, right? Yeshua, Jesus, sits at the right hand of the Father. Said it himself. He sits at the right hand of the Father. Okay? So both of them are sitting up there. And he awaits his return because he's coming back. And then there's going to be a physical reign. And according to that scroll, that apocalypse scroll to John, from John, right? That reigns for 1,000 years. Temple returns, priests expand and continue the role of service to the nations, and the world, our earth, will be governed by him. Leviticus moves into context. Okay, so here's an awkward challenge. So there's a point in that book, just this caught me when I was going through those notes again. He said that some of those who have died before are going to be raised up, right? It's great. I get it. So remember we're talking about paradigms, what things affect other things? Okay, so we have another paradigm challenge, because are they then also plucked out of heaven, right? So they're plucked out of heaven and then stuck back in their bodies and then put down here to work. Or do we again have a paradigm that we run into conflicts as we start to go into these stories? Man, I can't talk much about how we need to hold what we believe with an open hand, to be able to look at what we think and then figure out what other things affect what other things, right? Yeah, open hands. So our point to ponder, and Tim said something, and I want to repeat it because I thought it was really, really well articulated, and again, might even challenge another paradigm in its thought. It is in this cultural setting that we see Israel's God as totally different. He does get angry about human corruption, but it's never arbitrary. And he loves people. So he provides this clear way for Israel to know with confidence that they are forgiven and that despite their corruption, they are safe to live near his presence. So that is what made the book of Leviticus actually a revolutionary statement in its day. That's from Tim Mackie on Leviticus. Forgiveness, living in his presence. Maybe we need to read the book of Leviticus for its revolutionary statement, maybe in our day. And thanks for being with us tonight on The Dusty Feet.